Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that strangers, thousands of miles away, had divided your homeland without ever asking you. No negotiations, no permission, no representatives. Just rulers sitting around a table, drawing straight lines across an entire continent as if millions of lives were nothing more than ink on a map. That is exactly what happened to Africa. In less than 30 years, almost an entire continent was carved apart by European empires. The effects of that decision are still shaping the world today. This wasn't simply colonization. It was one of the largest land grabs in human history, and it all began inside a single conference room. Before European powers arrived, Africa was never an empty wilderness, as many old history books falsely suggested. It was home to hundreds of kingdoms, powerful empires, advanced trading cities, and millions of people speaking thousands of different languages. The Kingdom of Benin created remarkable bronze sculptures. The Ashanti Empire controlled enormous gold reserves. Ethiopia remained one of the world's oldest independent civilizations. Across the continent, trade routes connected kingdoms long before European ships appeared on the horizon. Africa wasn't waiting to be discovered. It had already built civilizations of its own, but Europe saw something else: opportunity. By the late 1800s, Europe had entered the Industrial Revolution. Factories consumed enormous amounts of raw materials: rubber, gold, ivory, copper, diamonds, palm oil, and coal. Every growing empire wanted more resources, more markets, and more power. Owning colonies became a symbol of national strength. The bigger your empire, the stronger your nation appeared. Soon, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and Spain all turned their attention toward Africa. Not because Africa was weak, but because it was rich, very rich. At first, European nations occupied only small areas along Africa's coastline. They traded, built ports, and established military outposts. But as competition between European empires intensified, everyone feared the same thing. If we don't take it first, someone else will. What began as exploration quickly transformed into a race. Explorers mapped rivers. Missionaries entered villages. Soldiers followed behind them. Every expedition became another claim. Every flag planted on African soil meant another piece of the continent disappearing. Europe wasn't exploring anymore. It was competing. Then came one of history's most astonishing meetings. In 1884, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck invited Europe's greatest powers to Berlin. Officially, the conference was supposed to prevent conflict between European nations. Unofficially, they were deciding who would own Africa. For nearly 3 months, delegates gathered around enormous maps. They debated borders, negotiated territories, made deals, and traded land. There was just one shocking detail. Not a single African leader was invited. Millions of people, thousands of cultures, and hundreds of kingdoms had absolutely no voice in deciding their own future. Lines were drawn with rulers, ignoring tribes, languages, religions, and centuries of history. Those borders, many of which still exist today, were created by people who had never even lived there. When the conference ended, the race accelerated. Britain expanded from Egypt toward South Africa. France pushed across West Africa. Germany claimed territories in East and Southwest Africa. Portugal strengthened its colonies. Belgium quietly prepared something far darker, a colony that would become one of history's greatest humanitarian disasters. Within just a few decades, around 90% of Africa had fallen under European control. Only 2 nations remained independent: Ethiopia, after defeating Italy in a stunning military victory, and Liberia, founded by formerly enslaved African Americans. The rest of the continent had been divided without consent, without mercy, without warning. But drawing borders on a map was the easy part. Taking the land would require unimaginable violence, and that was only the beginning. By the end of the Berlin Conference, Africa had been divided on paper, but maps don't surrender. People do. And Europe was about to discover that conquering an entire continent would come at an unimaginable human cost. European armies marched inland, determined to turn lines on a map into reality. Villages that resisted were burned to the ground. Entire communities were forced from their homes. Ancient kingdoms that had ruled for centuries suddenly faced machine guns, heavy artillery, and repeating rifles. Technology they had never encountered before. Many African warriors fought with extraordinary courage, defending their families, traditions, and homeland. But courage alone could not overcome the overwhelming military advantage of Europe's industrial powers. One by one, kingdoms that had stood for generations fell. Their flags disappeared. Their rulers were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Traditional governments collapsed, and foreign officials replaced local leaders. The land no longer belonged to the people who had lived there for centuries. It now belonged to distant empires thousands of miles away. For millions of Africans, freedom had been replaced by foreign rule. But nowhere was the brutality greater than the Congo. Officially, it wasn't even a Belgian colony. It was the personal property of one man, King Leopold II of Belgium. He claimed his mission was to bring civilization, education, Christianity, and humanitarian progress to Central Africa. The reality was something entirely different. The Congo became one of the largest forced labor systems in modern history. As the world's demand for rubber exploded during the Industrial Revolution, entire villages were ordered to meet impossible production quotas. If they failed, the punishment was immediate. Families were taken hostage. Homes were burned. Entire villages were destroyed. The colonial army, known as the Force Publique, ruled through terror. To prove that ammunition had not been wasted, soldiers were ordered to cut off the hands of those they killed, or sometimes even those who survived. Millions of Congolese suffered through starvation, disease, forced labor, violence, and displacement. Although historians continue to debate the exact number, many estimate that the population of the Congo declined by millions during Leopold's rule. International outrage eventually forced Belgium to take control of the territory from Leopold in 1908. But by then, unimaginable damage had already been done. It remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of colonialism. Yet Africa never accepted conquest without resistance. Across the continent, kingdoms, communities, and ordinary people fought to defend their homes. The Zulu kingdom challenged the British Empire in southern Africa. The modest forces resisted British expansion across Sudan. Samurai Touré fought a long and determined campaign against French colonial armies in West Africa. Countless other leaders organized rebellions that history rarely remembers today. Then, in 1896, Ethiopia shocked the world. At the Battle of Adwa, Emperor Menelik II united Ethiopian forces and defeated the invading Italian army. It was one of the few decisive African victories against a European colonial power. The victory echoed across the continent and inspired future generations fighting for independence. It proved something many believed impossible. Europe was powerful, but it was not invincible. Despite remarkable resistance, however, most of Africa eventually fell under colonial rule. The conquest changed Africa forever. Colonial governments reorganized entire economies to serve European industries rather than local communities. Millions of people were forced to grow cash crops instead of food for their own families. Gold, diamonds, rubber, copper, ivory, cocoa, and countless other resources flowed out of Africa and into European markets. Railroads were built, not to connect African societies, but to transport raw materials from the interior to ports where they could be shipped overseas. Artificial borders divided ethnic groups that had lived together for centuries, while forcing historic rivals into the same newly created colonies. Languages changed. Traditional cultures were suppressed. Local rulers lost their authority. Education systems were redesigned around colonial interests. Entire generations grew up under foreign governments that controlled nearly every aspect of daily life. Africa's wealth left the continent. Its consequences remained. Even today, many border disputes, political instability, and ethnic conflicts can trace part of their origins back to decisions made during the Scramble for Africa. By the early 20th century, nearly 90% of Africa was under European control. An entire continent had been transformed, not by its own people, but by foreign powers competing for wealth, resources, and global influence. The maps drawn in Berlin survived. The empires did not. One by one, Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Germany, Italy, and Spain eventually lost their African colonies as independence movements swept across the continent during the 20th century. But independence could not erase decades of exploitation, nor could it redraw borders created in distant conference rooms by men who had never walked the lands they divided. Even today, many African nations continue to face challenges rooted in that colonial era. The Scramble for Africa wasn't just about conquering land. It reshaped governments, economies, cultures, borders, and the lives of millions of people. Its legacy can still be seen in politics, trade, and conflicts across the continent more than a century later. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun. It's a line drawn on a map,